Kant's Capacitism and Theory of Rationality. That's the title. I start with the observation that the relation between rationality, and that's that slide, the introduction, and what has recently be termed capacitism is crucial actually for spelling out or to somehow come to terms with rationality, specifically in Kant. And what is capacitism? Capacitism is the view that's at least the way I use the term, the view that when it comes to theorizing about the possibility of cognition, the priority goes to the analysis of cognitive capacities. And this is, I think, what Kant does, which means then to find out about what rationality is in Kant, we need to look into capacities, and more specifically, so the nature of rationality in Kant. This means that we need to look into the relation between rational and non-rational capacities in Kant, which is obviously the understanding and sensibility. So the well-known proposal on the table about this is that we basically have two options, and those maybe who are familiar with the background here know what I'm talking about. It's Boyle's paper, 2016 paper on additive theories of rationality, a critique, which sort of made its career, and as to that distinction became a standard, where very briefly additive means that the capacity to reflect on reasons, and let's say that's sort of a very broad understanding of rationality maybe to start with. So is a special, of course, then rational module, as Boyle says, on top of sensibility, which we share with non-rational animals. And this sharing with non-rational animals will turn out to be one of the big issues in the debate. While transformative means that sensibility is transformed by the mere presence of rationality, that is, human sensibility is, quote, essentially different from their merely animal counterparts. So the difference, one of the fundamental differences is that between human and non-human, well, sensibility in the end. So what I will argue for then in this paper is with respect to Kantian rationality, so not rationality in general, that I think the dichotomy or the distinction between transformative versus additive is not exhaustive, and that we can also think about alternative models. And I will propose what I coined the subtractive theory of rationality later in the paper. And the second issue connected to this question is whether, one might even think that the subtractive model is maybe a kind of the additive model, but we're going to see. So I'm going to proceed as follows. In preparation of my argument, in the first section, I will distinguish between rationality, well, with respect to rationality, the concept of rationality between faculty and capacity, well, because Kant makes that distinction actually. Before I then turn to more specifically to these three models, so the two on the table, additive, transformative, and the third one, subtractive, is mine, and to then show that it is crucial to see that there is a radical difference between what Kant calls intuitional and conceptual representation, which makes it impossible, I think, that's at least what I'm going to argue for, to conceive of his theory of rationality in terms of transformation or transformative theory. It's rather subtractive, as I will argue, which might be a special kind of an additive theory of rationality. We're going to see. I mean, before I start, well, and then I have a concluding section on, unexpectedly, maybe on open questions. But let me just say one thing. In this paper, I will limit myself to perceptually given reasons for belief in Kant, and won't say anything about desire-based or moral reasons or reasoning for action, which is, of course, another substantial part of when it comes to rationality. This is due to the time constraints of this talk. So it's really, the focus is on the rather theoretical, say, side of rationality. So section 1, rationality, faculty, and capacity. What we should be clear about, I think, is that we won't find the concept rationality in Kant, right? We won't find it in Fichte, Schelling, Hegel either. Why is that so? Well, in Kant, it's maybe explainable since the concept itself, Rationalität in German at least, I didn't check for rationality in English, but I guess it's very similar, appears only at the very beginning of the 19th century and really only in mid-19th century. The only use you find of rationality, Rationalität, is in 18th century math. So Rationalität der Zahlen. This is what you find in the sources, in Kästner and others. But this is not the meaning of rationality, of course, that we are talking about. A second important point is that if you open a dictionary and you look up what rationality is, you find rationality is, Rationalität, is thinking or acting. And I think that's certainly not the case. Rationality is not thinking or acting, and also rationality is not reason. Reason is a capacity, a faculty, Kant would say. And rationality or rational is a property that maybe pertains to the mind, or maybe even to a faculty, but it's certainly not to be mixed up with reason. Yeah? So reason in terms of Kantian Vernunft. I think this is important to keep in mind. But sure, of course, I won't give you sort of a full-fledged or not even a working definition of rationality now. We could think of something like reflecting on reasons, but it might turn out that that is not even adequate. But I think the best way to start is to consider methodological requirements that theories of rationality, and now here in our context here, Kant's Capacitism, must meet. So what do I mean? If it is the case that capacities sort of help us to understand what Kantian rationality, say, is, then the question is, of course, so which ones, which capacities, and how to distinguish them. Yeah, I think this is rarely discussed in the literature. And well, answering this question means to come up with a criterion of individuation, because we need to individuate capacities. And this is in Kant done by the distinction between faculty and capacity. This is a terminological, classical, traditional distinction we find in Leibniz and others, such that, as you will see, the kind of capacitism Kant holds is what I coin faculty-capacitism. So Kantian capacitism is faculty-capacitism. Now, to understand this, what options do we have for individuating capacities? Because that was the methodological question to ask and to answer. And individuating faculties, we might have, or certainly have, this list. This is a list of, is of course not exhaustive, not complete. We can do it descriptively because if we look into Baumgarten, for example, Baumgarten's Metaphysica, he derives faculties and also capacities by way of simply observing what the human mind can do. Think, reflect, so there is the capacity then to think and to reflect, and so on. You have a whole bunch of capacities. But we could also try to do this analytically, as I would say, and this is actually Kant's approach by, and I'm going to be much more, we'll explain this in much greater detail later, by isolating faculties and capacities. Analytically, and the third option is, of course, historically, in what is known as the idealist history of self-consciousness, in, for example, Maimon, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and others, but which systematically simply means we're gonna understand the development of cognitive capacities historically, in the sense that we explain how capacities develop throughout the individual cognizer's cognitive development, so to speak. But that's not what I'm gonna look at in this talk. I rather want to turn now to how exactly the individuation of the faculties and then capacities works in Kant. So what is the model? What is the procedure he is applying here to convince us of there are exactly two faculties and exactly two coordinate capacities that we have. As I've said, so the distinction between faculty and capacity is not new in Kant. Yeah, Kant simply takes this up from the tradition. Leibniz, Baumgarten make this distinction, not only between sensibility and understanding, but also between the capacities, and the German is for capacities is Fähigkeit. And that's why faculties cannot be translated as Fähigkeit, and capacity cannot be translated and should not be translated as Vermögen. It's rather faculty is Vermögen and capacity is Fähigkeit. And the idea is the following: to individuate sensibility, we need to identify the specific kind of capacity pertaining to sensibility. And this is in Kant to receive sensible representations, not to form them, but to receive them. That's the specific capacity the faculty of sensibility has. And unsurprisingly then, the specific capacity the understanding has is to form general representations. To form general representations is what profiles the understanding as the human faculty of concept use, of course. So the model is really, or the idea is really, that the nature of a cognitive faculty is determined through its key, essential, core cognitive capacity. And as I said, this is what we find in Baumgarten. Just to give an example, the distinction between facultas and capacitas, faculty and capacity. But the question now is, of course, how does this relate to rationality? How does this help us to understand what rationality is? So human rationality, as I said, is then to be determined alternatively as either additive, transformative, or subtractive, as I just proposed, using this distinction between faculty and capacity, specifically with respect to the subtractive model. And this is what I'm going to do now in section 2, where I will try to show how this distinction between faculty and capacity helps us to explain rationality in Kant. So, as I said, Kantian rationality must be, according to the idea of faculty-capacitism, be explained by determining the specific relation between rational and non-rational capacities. We have two options that are on the table proposed by Boyle, additive, transformative theories, and of rationality. But as I said, I think this distinction is not exhaustive. There's a third one, and maybe a fourth one, and even more than those. But if you follow the literature, the discussion in the literature, then you can get easily the impression that, yeah, people think it's exhaustive. There are no more options. But I think there are. To better now grasp this specific idea, we should look, I think, into the order and relation between rational and non-rational capacities in terms of what options do we have, yeah, with respect to the proposals that have been made. And what I mean is this. So in principle, when it comes to rational and non-rational capacities and their relation, we can work with a bottom-up approach, a linear approach, an all-the-way-down approach, or a top-down approach. In the following sense, that in additive theories, if I'm correct, this relation can be understood either as bottom-up or linear. In transformative theories, that relation is from the start all the way down. And in the third option that I'm going to propose, the subtractive theory of rationality, it is top-down. To give you an examples now, or more explication on this, additive theories. So in additive theories, as I said, one option is a bottom-up additive account of rationality, where rationality is, of course, supplementary, but supplementary to basic sensory faculties, in the way that we start off with very fundamental capacities of the outer senses, and then pile up on those very fundamental faculties or even capacities, the more complex one, until we arrive at a rational capacity that then sort of forms the full account or idea of what human rationality is. And this can be found actually in a very influential book. Many of you know this certainly, Condillac from 1754, Traité des Sensations, where Condillac does exactly that. I think it's a very good example of a bottom-up additive theory. The idea is, in Condillac, there is the statue, and he then tries to sort of explain how the statue can be equipped with fundamental, basic faculties and capacities, sensory capacities to start with, and then add other ones to have then, in the end, the full, namely the living statue, or the statue that then comes to life. The second option in additive theories is what I've termed the linear additive, which is, I think, the Kantian model. So cognition is compositional by way of the cooperation of two equal, and that's important, equal non-continuous faculties, namely sensibility and understanding. I think this is what Kant does, and this is what McDowell, for example, identifies as, so to speak, a bad understanding, yeah, a rather unfortunate understanding of Kant. So this is from Mind and World, where McDowell writes, so if we share perception with mere animals, then of course we have something in common with them. Now, there is a temptation to think it must be possible to isolate what we have in common with them by stripping off what is special about us, so as to arrive at a residue that we can recognize as what figures in the perceptual lives of mere animals. So the key word here, I think, and the word that indicates that he is referring to Kant without saying or mentioning Kant's name here, is isolate, because this is exactly what Kant uses. Yeah? So in the Transcendental Aesthetic, he says, I'm isolating, isolieren, sensibility. And he says the same in the Transcendental Analytic. Here, I'm isolating the understanding, isolieren. And again, in the Transcendental Dialectic, in the introductory sections, he says, here I'm going to try to isolate reason as an independent source of cognition. Will this be successful? No. There are only two successful cases of isolation, namely transcendental aesthetic sensibility, and the second is the transcendental analytic, the understanding. The isolation of reason as an independent source of cognition is not possible, is not successful. Let's McDowell on isolation and the linear additive. What I've said is the linear additive one, although McDowell, as you know, is not very much in favor of the non-Hegelian, so to speak, understanding of Kant's theory of the faculties. But now transformative theories. As I said, transformative theories, I think, are those kinds that can be described as all the way down theories of rationality, where cognitive capacities must be conceived as continuous, in the sense that human sensible capacity is, quote, Boyle, that's the way he introduces it, as transformed by the presence of rationality, such that we have or arrive at rational perceiving and rational desiring. So perceiving as a form of sensible reference to the world is itself rational. And the question later on will be, of course, yeah, can this be, is this really a Kantian idea? What I think transformative theories must presuppose is that there's a continuity between non-rational and rational capacities. Why? Because, yeah, as McDowell said in this earlier quote, we cannot strip off faculties. Yeah? So this is an illusion, yeah, among some, Kant scholars maybe who see it that way, but that's simply not possible. So here, again, quoting McDowell is, that's, I think, a description along the lines of Boyle that comes very close to that idea of transformation. So becoming open to the world, he says, not just able to cope with an environment, yeah, that's not the point here, transforms the character of the disclosing that perception does for us. Now, how is then that transformation possible? And he's very clear. Well, it's Bildung. Our Bildung actualizes some of the potentialities we are born with. Now, Bildung, well, is not taken from Kant, is of course taken from Hegel. And in that sense, I think he's very much in line with Hegel, since the translation of Bildung should not be, in Hegel at least, should not be education, of course, but formation. Yeah? And so you can see, so transformation and formation, character formation, is exactly at the core of this theory of transformative theories of rationality. And then finally, subtractive theories. So what do I mean here? So here we do not begin with, as we have it in the additive, in additive theories, for example, in Condillac, with just fundamental sensible capacities. No, what we do is we begin with a form, what I would say is an unconstrained non-human rationality, or form of unconstrained non-human rationality. And then from there subtract that form that is not to thereby determine human, and then subtract from that unconstrained non-human rationality that form what it is not to thereby negatively, as Kant says, determine human non-rational and rational capacities. Where do we find this? Yeah, there's a place where we find this, I think, namely in the third critique, in the Critique of Judgment, paragraph 76, 77, the intuitive understanding. There, Kant says, so we have to seek a certain contingency in the constitution of our understanding in order to notice this as a special character of our understanding in distinction from other possible ones. I'm not going into debating about, so what kind of possibility should that be? This other kind of understanding. Is this just a logical possibility? Is it at all a logical possibility? Certainly not a real possibility, but at least the idea is we need to have this other kind of, or the idea of another kind of understanding to make conceivable or intelligible the kind of understanding we have. And the same goes for sensibility, of course. Second quote that explains this, I think, clearly is from paragraph 77 again. So in order for us to be able at least to conceive of the possibility of such an agreement of the things of nature with the power of judgment, we must at the same time conceive of another understanding in relation to which we can represent that agreement of natural laws with our power of judgment. So here again, the idea is that there is, well, a contrast that helps us to explain and understand what the kind of understanding and sensibility, by conclusion, is that we have. So to bring this to the point, so arriving at human rationality then means, according to the subtractive model, that subtracting the capacity of, as Kant in 77 says, complete spontaneity and so on, from the intuitive understanding to then end up with or arrive at two faculties, so the two faculties of human understanding, namely the spontaneous understanding and receptive sensibility. And this is, if this is an option, a viable one, then it's clear it's not transformative. Yeah? It's clearly not transformative, but in the end, the question is, of course, not yet answered, how we actually can distinguish between those faculties and the coordinate capacities, since this only concerns the most, rather the fundamental structure. Yeah? But I think what we now need to take into account is that Kant thinks, of course, that these faculties and capacities are radically different. And this is my major point now in the argument, that it's one way to somehow explain how we should conceive of the rational, say, relation between rational capacities and non-rational capacities in Kant. But the other, even more important point in this context is how to now identify more specifically the kinds of faculties and capacities we have. So why, in the end, of course, in view of my proposal, why subtractive theories? And here I would point simply to the fact, to start with, that sensibility and understanding are for Kant radically different and at the same time irreducible and specifically non-continuous faculties. Why is this so? Because of the respective capacities, the two capacities that pertain to sensibility on the one hand and understanding on the other, namely the capacity to have intuitional representations, sensibility, and the capacity to form conceptual representations pertaining to the understanding. And those capacities are radically different. And by conclusion, therefore, it's, as a matter of fact, sensibility and understanding themselves are therefore radically different. That's my point. Radically different means sensibility cannot be changed through the presence of the rational capacity, because this is what Boyle, McDowell, and others argue. It is possible to change the nature of sensibility by the mere presence, as Boyle says, of rationality. So in transformative theories, that's just another way of saying the same thing. Boyle says the faculty of sensibility itself receives the rational form. Yeah. So it's not as if it's just quoting Kant or so. You know, this section where Kant says, well, what we're going to do in the schematism, for example, is to intellectualize sensibility or sensible representations. But this is not what Kant would claim what happens. Yeah? It is not the case that sensibility is changed. It's just that sensible particulars are subsumed under concepts. This is what Kant means by intellectualizing, addressing Leibniz in particular. So that's quite a strong claim that I think in Boyle, that the faculty of sensibility receives the rational or the conceptual form. Whereas I think now in faculty capacitism, the question whether sensibility or intuition receives the form of the understanding or of the concept, that question can only be answered in the negative. No, it does not. And this, I think, can be seen from Kant's argument from isolation. There's a threefold isolation, as I've already mentioned in the Critique of Pure Reason. The first one is the isolation of sensibility in the transcendental aesthetic, B36. Sensibility is isolated in the transcendental aesthetic, Kant says, as the intuitive faculty. The next isolation takes place in the transcendental analytic. Kant says the understanding is here isolated as the conceptual faculty, B87. And there is a third isolation to come in the transcendental dialectic. Kant says, sorry. Let's see whether we can isolate reason as an independent faculty. He uses the same word, isolieren. And the outcome is, no, we can't. Reason itself cannot be isolated as an independent faculty. It's the faculty of principles and so on and so forth, but it's not an independent faculty from which, independent of sensible intuition, we can arrive at contentful, justified, objective propositions about the world. So synthetic propositions a priori, independent of intuition. So we have then, given this isolation that Kant carries out in the transcendental aesthetic and in the transcendental analytic, we have two mutually exclusive profiles pertaining to sensibility and understanding in the following sense. So when it comes to intuition, we see in the transcendental aesthetic that Kant identifies intuition as being singular representation, intuition is directly referential. Intuition is for humans, for human cognizers, sensible. And intuition includes its parts within itself. Whereas when it comes to concepts, we see that conceptual representations are general representations. They are not directly referential. They're only indirectly referential. They're not sensible, but intellectual representations. And they include partial representations under themselves and not in themselves or within themselves even. And I think that this mutually exclusive, these mutually exclusive profiles just simply show that the transformative account of rationality in Kant does not work out, since there is, sure, the cooperation of sensibility and intuition and understanding and concept, but that cooperation that must be there in order to arrive at cognition does not mean that intuition or sensibility is somehow transformed, because that's simply not possible in Kant. So there is no, I think, transformation going on in Kant, since if we think of an information in that radical sense of sensibility by concepts, we're not talking about the kind of sensibility as Kant lays sensibility out in the Transcendental Aesthetic. It's a different kind of sensibility, but certainly not the kind of sensibility that Kant tries to argue for there. And the same goes for the understanding. The understanding should not be conceived of as a faculty that does some sort of transforming. If that would be the case, in exactly that sense that the understanding changes the nature of sensibility, we are not talking about the human understanding anymore, in Kant at least. So that, I think, is the reason why Kant's capacitism cannot account for transformative theory of rationality, if my argument is correct. But let's see, there are of course open questions. I'm fully aware of this, and I'm happy to discuss these questions and take many other questions that may help me to sort of change my mind or to make this this whole thing more precise, or maybe even to give up my proposal, could well be. But the open questions I have in mind here, there are many others, is that of course the transformatist could say, well, yeah, it's true that the faculty profiles are of sensibility and understanding are irreconcilable, but that does not threaten the rational form of sensibility or even perception, right? But that is what I can see, as I've just tried to explain. I think the sort of transformation that supposedly goes on is really radically, or would radically change sensibility in such a way that we're not talking about human sensibility or human intuition, the capacity to form to receive singular representation in sensibility, such that I'm not convinced that this critical question would sort of change my mind on this. The second question you might have is that, well, is the subtractive kind of rationality that I've proposed really an independent, a third independent proposal, theory, or is it rather a kind of specification of the additive conception? Here I'm open, I'm not quite sure. It's of course the case that also in subtractive theories, or a subtractive theory of rationality, sensibility and understanding can be distinguished in the same way as in additive theories. But at least the difference really seems to be that subtractive theories would start from this idea of, if you take Kant's third critique, paragraph 77, the intuitive understanding as some sort of strong, in a strong sense, non-human kind of rationality, to then subtract from there the idea of human rationality as being composed of two equal faculties and capacities of cognition. The third question might be related to the last point that I've mentioned, is the conceivability challenge, as one might call it, for subtractive rationality, in the sense that a quote from the first critique: so a faculty of cognition, Kant says, entirely distinct from the human, not merely in degree, but even in intuition and kind. So this reads as if this kind of rationality that I've just mentioned, for example, the intuitive understanding, is not even conceivable to us. How could we even conceive of this, of the logical possibility? Not talking of the real possibility of such an intuitive understanding. So is it actually at all legitimate to then derive from that non-human kind of rationality, the intuitive understanding, human rationality, as being composed of non-rational and rational faculties and capacities? Since, if we look into another quote here from paragraph 77 now, from the Creek of Judgment, where Kant says, yeah, this is possible. One can conceive of an intuitive understanding negatively, he says, namely merely as not discursive. But I'm not quite satisfied with this, since where is this getting us, right? So conceiving of an intuitive understanding merely negative, of course, would require us to be more specific about what the constitution of such an intuitive understanding is, and just saying it's not discursive, I think, so just describing it negatively does not help us out here, I guess. And the fifth point, this is rather in perspective, is of course, okay, this might well be Kantian rationality in rather theoretical terms, but what about moral reasoning, moral rationality? What does Kantian rationality look like there? So thanks for listening, and I'm now interested, of course, what you think.